Hey students, how are you doing? Good to see you. Glad that you're back here. Watch another video here. So we're going to learn today about what makes things alive and what makes things not alive. Okay, so we're going to learn about what things are living and what things are not. So this is the first lecture out of chapter 2. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started with this. And we're going to learn about 5 different things that makes things living and not alive. Okay, so how would you know if something's alive? I want you to think about that just for a moment. What makes something alive? What are 5 things, or maybe even one thing, that all things have in common if they're alive? What are 2 things? Write that down really quick. What are 3 things that make something alive? Can you think of 4 things that make all things alive? 5. There are 5 things that make things alive. By the end of this lecture, by the end of this class, you'll know all 5 things and how to apply them, right? So if you look at right here, you have some things here that are pretty easy to see that are alive. You have a little baby here. You could probably tell me why that baby's alive. A mushroom, is it alive? Is it not? How about water? Is water alive? Virus, we've learned a lot about viruses lately. Is a virus alive? Is bacteria alive? Below here where my picture is, you can see some fruit. Is fruit alive? It came from a tree. I think that's alive, but is the fruit alive? How about a worm here? A worm. And we have some soil. Is the soil alive? The worm may be alive, but is the soil alive? And how about this rock? Is the rock alive? So I want you to, as we go throughout this lecture today, in this lesson, I want you to think about, remember these pictures here: mushroom and baby and water and worm and rock and virus and vegetable and bacteria and even the soil. What makes them alive or not alive? What reasonings could you give why they're alive and why they're not alive? So we're going to talk about something here called spontaneous generation. There was a thought in the 16th and 17th century that living creatures could arise out of non-living things, that things that weren't alive would come out of non-living things. So that was a common belief, and there was a scientist by the name of Reddy that disproved this. And what they noticed now, there wasn't refrigeration, easy refrigeration like we have today with our electric refrigerators and freezers. So meat spoiled a lot, and bugs would suddenly appear on meat called maggots. Okay, they're really just larvae, the baby flies, if you can think of it that way. Okay, so what was thought was that the meat suddenly, out of the meat, suddenly became these larvae, these flies. And so it was thought that it was spontaneous, that they just came up all on their own. Well, Reddy disproved this by he had an open jar and he put the pieces of meat in there. And after a few days, he noticed that flies would fly in there. And then after a few days, he noticed that there were some eggs in there. And suddenly the eggs would hatch, and there were the larvae, what we call the maggots, on the spoiled meat. So what was happening is that the maggots weren't suddenly coming out of the meat, is that the eggs were being laid by the flies, and then when the eggs would hatch, the larvae would appear, and they would instantly have some food to eat. So if you think about it from the fly standpoint, it's pretty good. You lay your eggs, so when the babies are born, they have something to eat right away. Makes sense. So to make sure that he was correct, he also did the same thing with 2 jars that had a cloth top on it. So the odor of the meat, and that's what attracts the flies, is the odor of the decaying and rotten meat. So the flies could smell it. They would still lay their eggs on the cloth, but they couldn't get down to the meat. So the maggots would hatch. The eggs would hatch into maggots on top of the cloth. So what this proved is that the larvae were not coming from the meat. Rather, it was a part of the life cycle of the fly. And so spontaneous generation was proved wrong. Well, it popped back up. This idea popped back up in the 1860s, right around when the microscope was invented. And a lot of scientists were being able to see things that are very, very small, things like what were bacteria and smaller organisms that the naked eye can't see, through the aid of a microscope. So it was brought up again that there must be some that creatures can come out of non-living things, like creatures suddenly show up on a leaf or on a piece of grass or in some dirt or in a sample of water that sat around for a few days. Suddenly these creatures bursted up. So a man named Louis Pasteur came up with a process to prove or disprove spontaneous generation again. And so he boiled two flasks with these long gooseneck tubes attached to them, one right here. Okay, so in one, so by boiling it, all bacteria or living things were killed because they cannot live in that high temperature, and then it was allowed to sit. So it had one that was boiled and allowed to sit, and then one that was boiled, but then the top was broken off or opened up, so there was a much bigger opening here. This one had a small opening, so you had a little bit of broth that was stuck in this tube, and so the in the one that was not broken, the bacteria did not grow in here because there was no bacteria for it to grow in. The bacteria did not find their way there. In the broken one, because the tube was broken, there was a much bigger opening. Bacteria and other types of organisms suddenly started growing in this broth. And the reason is because there's a larger opening where they could get into. So they are in the air finding their way into this container. Here they could not find their way into that, so that proved that it wasn't that they spontaneously generated or grew out of water or this broth, is that they were exposed to what was already the open air environment that the bacteria grew on. So again, spontaneous generation, so living things cannot grow out of non-living things. So what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about the five things that make living things living things. The first thing is that they all reproduce. All living things make more of themselves, okay? And they make more of themselves that are like themselves, or what's called their kind. They make more of their kind. So cats make kittens, dogs make puppies, flowers make seeds that grow more flowers. This is a dandelion puffball. If you blow this, it'll spread around the lawn or the grassy area, and more dandelions, those little yellow flowers, will grow. Cucumbers make cucumbers that have seeds in them so that the seeds can grow to more cucumbers. And ducks have ducklings, and then those ducklings will grow into ducks and have more ducklings. So the idea is, if it's alive, it can make more of itself. It can make more of itself. Okay. The second thing is that all living things respond to their environment, meaning that as the environment changes, or if something happens in their environment, they respond to it. Whether it be, like, if you imagine you walking across this bridge here, you would respond. Your heart would race. You would feel the sway of the bridge as you walked across. As you looked up and down, you might get a little sweaty. Your hands might start shaking. Okay, you would definitely feel the breeze on your face, and your face would blink from the breeze going across. So you respond to the environment because you're alive. So here are some responses to living things. Here we have a individual here doing push-ups, and if they continue to do push-ups and exercise and yoga, their heart will speed up to get more blood to those muscles. They might begin to sweat to keep their body cool. This kitten right here, this cat, is surprised, and it looks like it's about to pounce. So it responds to a startled look, that startled look that that cat has. We have this girl here that's in a jacket with some gloves and a hat on and a scarf, trying to keep from being cold. If not, her body would shiver, and that's a response to the environment. This zebra may be running away from a lion or a prey or a hyena, something that's coming after it, a predator that's coming after it. And then we have a flower. A flower, if we respond to the environment, if you were to smell a flower, or a flower may open up in the daytime and close in the evening based on the amount of light responding to its environment. Another one's a famous one's a turtle. A turtle goes into its shell, hides its head to protect it in its protective shell because it might be startled. So living things, these are sort of some big examples, respond to their environment, even at small levels that we'll maybe talk about in later lectures. Okay. So the first one was that they all reproduce, they make more of themselves. Second, they respond to their environment. And the third one is all living things use energy. Okay. Now, I'm not talking about turning on a light or plugging in our iPod, or using some fuel in a car to come to school or drive to the store. Energy is food. Energy is food. Okay. So all living things use objects or energy or some other thing to make energy. Now, animals like you and I use food to make energy. Okay, this is the food that I'm talking about that's helpful and good for us. Things like broccoli and olives and peppers and vegetables, leafy greens, and even some nice proteins, some meats, and some dairy. Those are all things that our body needs to keep functioning. Now, you might be thinking this will give you some energy, but not for very long. Pizza and hot Cheetos and burgers and M&Ms and Monster Energy drinks, those are great. They're a lot of fun. They taste good, but this is what we need. This is what keeps us going and keeps us healthy, this type of energy. Now, we're animals, so human beings are animals, and animals can be thought of in three different ways based on how they eat or how they get energy. One is a carnivore. Carnivore, like a wolf here, survives on eating other animals. It eats flesh. Carne means flesh. The original word means flesh. Okay. So a dog or a cat and wolves and lions, they eat um, animals, other animals to stay alive, okay, to get their energy. Herbivores eat plants. Herb is like a herb, or an herb is a plant. So things like rabbits and squirrels and chipmunks and that sort of thing, they will eat plants to get their energy. So they get their energy from plants. Omnivores like you and I, or a bear, will eat berries and nuts and plants and animals. So we're both carnivore and herbivore. We'll also eat other things like, I guess, nuts are as a part of an herb because it comes from a tree, things like that. So omni means many or all. So they eat from many sources or all sources. Herb means eats only plants, and carnivore means it eats meat or other flesh. Now, plants get their energy not just from food, but they make their own food. Where the other ones, like animals, they have somebody else has to produce their food and then they consume it. So a wolf will eat a smaller animal like a rabbit. A rabbit will eat grass or eat some sort of plant. Human beings like us will eat meat or eat an apple or eat a pear or eat an almond from a tree. Okay, something else produced that source of energy that we're consuming to give us energy, right? Plants make their own energy. That's what's called an autotroph. They make their own energy and they do a process called photosynthesis. Photo means light, synthesis means to make or a process. Synthesize or to make or to process. It's a process of making something. All right. So how they do that is by the chemical reaction, which we'll learn a little bit later when we go into plants later in the year. But for right now, it's light plus a little carbon dioxide plus some water. All of that chemical reaction allows them to produce and change these ingredients into carbohydrate, which is a sugar that gives it its energy to grow. And it also produces oxygen, which it doesn't need. So it gives off the oxygen through its leaves, which is what human beings and other animals need to grow. All right. So plants produce their own energy, but they still make or use energy. And human beings and animals like us, we use energy from food from something else that something else made. So our first three here that we've gone through is that they all reproduce, all living things respond to their environment, all living things make or use energy. And the fourth is all living things develop and grow. All living things develop and grow. I want you to think about here we have some apple seeds from an apple that produce an apple tree that produces more apples. Here you have this little baby that's grown into a toddler, that's grown into a young adult, that grows into an older adult. Here we have a lamb, baby lamb, that grows into these teenager lambs, that grows into an adult lamb. Okay, so all living things develop and grow. So if it is living, it's going to at least do a portion of its life going to develop into a fully functioning. So now for some of us, Like for human beings, that takes many years for us to go to full. You're not really fully developed as a person with your brain and all of your body parts and everything until you're about 23 or 24 years old. Right? Your first couple years of life, you're changing a lot, and you change a lot again in your early teenage years and your adolescent years, and you really don't stop growing and functioning, even your brain fully forming until you're in your early 20s. Okay, but an apple, it may take 10 years from a seed to grow an apple. Okay, sometimes it's a little bit faster. Let's say 5 years. Um, Lambs may be fully developed within 1 year. Okay, so but what they all have in common is that they all start at one place and they grow and develop into a fully functioning organism later. Okay, they don't start off fully grown. They grow into that. So all living things will develop. A plant will grow, form a flower, form a seed, drop that seed, and potentially, if it's an annual, meaning it comes back every year, it'll die, and then more seeds will grow. So what happens is that there's a life cycle to all living things that they'll develop and grow in. So our four things that we've learned so far: that all living things, they reproduce, they respond to their environment, they use or make energy, and that they develop and grow. The last one is all living things are made of the building block of all living things, which are cells. Okay, cells. Now, cells are tiny cities. Okay, these are a picture of a couple of different cells. Here we have a plant cell. Here we have a skin cell. Here we have some blood cells, and here are some just a typical animal cell here. Now, all cells are tiny little cities. Now, we're going to spend a whole chapter just on what the cell is and all the different parts and what are called the different organelles of a cell. And here's an example of that right now: an animal cell and a plant cell. And they all have these inside the cell are all these different organelles, or you can think of them as team members or parts of a city. So parts of the city where the power is produced and where the road is laid down and where the garbage is collected, and you have the government and the mayor, and then you have the police officers, and you have the firefighters, and you have all those that keep the city running. Those things are within things like those things that have specific jobs to keep the city, the cell running, are called organelles. So an animal cell is a little bit different from a plant cell. We'll talk about the differences between an animal cell and a plant cell because they have different functions. Some of them are similar. They have similar organelles and similar functions. Others have additional things, and some lack other things. So all living things are going to be made of cells, and these cells collectively help the organism run. They collect together to make tissue, and then that tissue makes an organ, and all of those organs make up an organ system. So depending on the type of organism it is, it may not have all of that structure in it, but all of them, an organism may not have a respiratory system or cardiovascular system, but it will have a cell. At the basic level, all living things have cells, are made of cells. So in our five things we learned about so far today, that all living things are made of cells, that was number five. Number four was that all living things grow. Okay, number three is that all living things use energy. Number three was that they all respond to their environment. And number one was that they all reproduce. And I'm going to teach you one last thing before we go today. The last thing is called homeostasis. Homeostasis or homeostasis is organisms' ability to maintain their internal environment. That the one thing that living things do is that they try and attempt to stabilize their environment. It's the reason you shiver. It's the reason you sweat. It's the reason that a turtle may go back into its shell. It's the reason an organism will reproduce is to maintain its internal environment. So there are different ways to do that. Reptiles maintain their temperature by moving in the sun and out of the sun, into the shade, into the sun, right? You and I will sweat or shiver. So that's what's called homeostasis, and organisms are always attempting to maintain that. So that's one thing we'll talk about a little bit later. So I'm going to give you an activity that I want you to do now. That'll be online in Google Classroom. I'll give that to you. It'll be up there on what is alive and what is not. And you'll see that activity that is posted on Google Classroom. So that's it for now. That's it for now. And I will see you soon. Bye bye.